Chapter 1. Playboys in the Holy Land. I consider this new crisis that has emerged to be a blessing. I believe that it is the Turks' ultimate duty either to live like an honorable nation or to exit the stage of history gloriously. Jamal Pasha, Governor of Syria, on Turkey's entry into World War I, November 2nd, 1914. The storm began as a mild weather disturbance, one fairly common for that time of year. For several days in early January 1914, a hot, dry breeze had come off the Sahara Desert to pass over the winter-cooled waters of the eastern Mediterranean. By the morning of the 9th, this convergence had spawned a strong southwesterly wind, one that grew in intensity as it made landfall over southern Palestine. By the time it approached Beersheba, a small village on the edge of the Zin Desert some 25 miles inland, this wind threatened to trigger a khamsin, or sandstorm. For the inexperienced, being caught out in the desert during a khamsin can be unsettling. While it shares some of the properties of a severe thunderstorm, the same drop in barometric pressure beforehand, the same prelude of buffeting wind, the fact that sand is falling rather than water means visibility can rapidly drop to just a few feet, and the constant raking of sand against the body, coating the nose and mouth, and collecting in every crevice of clothing, can induce a feeling of suffocation. In the grip of this sensation, the mind can easily seize upon the worst idea, to journey on, to attempt to fight one's way out of the storm. Men routinely become lost and die, acting on this impulse. But the 3 young British men waiting in Beersheba that afternoon were not inexperienced. They had lingered an extra day in the village, a lonely outpost of perhaps 800 inhabitants, best known as a watering hole for passing camel caravans, in expectation of the arrival of an expedition party led by 2 Americans. By dusk, however, there was still no sign of the Americans, and what had earlier appeared no more threatening than a dull brown haze in the west had now formed up into a mile-high wall of approaching sand. Shortly after dark, the khamsin rolled in. Throughout that night, the storm raged. In the small house the British men shared, sand spattered against the shuttered windows like driven rain, and all their efforts to seal the place couldn't prevent them and everything else inside from becoming coated in a fine layer of desert dust. By dawn the winds had abated somewhat, enough that the risen sun appeared as a pale silvery orb in the eastern sky. The khamsin finally died off in early afternoon, allowing the residents of Beersheba to emerge from their homes and tents and move about. It was then that the Britons received some news of the Americans. Apparently caught out by the impending storm, they had drawn camp the previous evening in the desert just a few miles east of town. The 3 men saddled their camels and made for the American camp. Considering the surrounding desolation, the opulence they found there made for a rather bizarre spectacle. Along with a couple of horse-drawn carts hauling silage for the party's herd of pack animals, were several more to carry its larger field furniture. Now that the khamsin had passed, the native orderlies were busily breaking camp, including dismantling the 2 very fine and spacious bell tents, undoubtedly purchased from one of the better expedition outfitters in London or New York, that were the habitations of the 2 young Americans leading the expedition. These men, both in their mid-20s and clad in Western field suits and bowler hats, were named William Yale and Rudolph McGovern. As they explained to their British visitors, they were in southern Palestine as part of a grand tour of the Holy Land, an adventure that, when the sandstorm hit, had become a bit more than they bargained for. But there was something about the Americans that didn't quite add up. Although they were well-dressed and obviously traveling in high style, there was little about the men, McGovern small and reserved, Yale barrel-chested with a boxer's rough-hewn face, that suggested them as either natural traveling companions or likely candidates for a pilgrimage tour of biblical sites. Then there was their demeanor. Encountering other foreigners in this lonely corner of Syria was such a novelty that it tended to induce a kind of instant camaraderie, but there was none of this with Yale and McGovern.